Welcome to UberCube, the podcast we discuss all things Cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka Uberbear, and today I'm joined by both of my amazing hosts, but let's talk about the one that's the most amazing.
So, Stu, how are you?
He said the most amazing.
Fine. Hi, I'm May, also known as Magic.
Everybody loves magic. And then there's this guy.
Yes, it's Stu.
Hi.
Hi.
It's spooky season. We're getting there. The weather's changing. We're not quite there, but it's Friday the 13th during this day of recording. So we wanted to have a little bit of a good time. And all of the Duskmourn spoilers are out, and I'm excited about it. The House of Horrors.
I just realized that it is actually Friday the 13th.
It's kind of clever, right?
That it is.
And what a fantastic day to be doing this episode. Nicely done.
Yeah, it's rainy,
Very
it's gloomy,
spooky.
it's spooky, all the things. We're getting there. And we've got some more spooky stuff in the lineup.
Look, spooky season, best season.
Heck yeah.
You can't change my mind.
Yeah, it's Cube Con, spooky season,
It is.
all the above. Cube Con, nobody actually wanted any horror cubes this year, but that's okay. Wizards of the Coast took care of it for us, and they're inserting said horror into cubes. I'm excited about it. And before we go any further, I want to just say thank you to our newest Patreon, Chris Fitzgerald. And if you're interested in becoming a Patreon, you can find us at Patreon.com/UberCube. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for supporting the show.
Yeah.
But before we dive into the additions and subtractions and all the things we do here at UberCube, we're going to enjoy our libations of the show. And let's start out with the lovely May. What are you having on this delightful Friday the 13th?
So, I am not drinking alcohol today, just because I've already had a party recently. So,
What'd you do for a party?
my resources are kind of exhausted.
Well, now you got to tell us all about this party. What was the party that we weren't invited to?
We had a bunch of people over to play Magic, but I didn't end up playing a lot of Magic because I was spending a lot of time with my friend who came in from Ireland.
Ooh.
But this is related because the thing that I am drinking is the Irish tea, Irish breakfast that she brought from Ireland.
Very cool.
And since we're both tea drinkers, she's just like, here's a bunch of them. And if you ever want more, just let me know so that I can have them, shipped over. And I'm just like,
Tea is such a cool gift.
It is.
Tea is such a nice gift to give to someone, I think. I like getting tea.
I love tea. I like a good proper glass of tea, though. Yeah. I'm not here to play around with my tea anymore. I remember, little side note, I met a long time ago, I met a wonderful British man, and he said, "Hey, do you got a cup of tea? Can I get a spot of tea?" Absolutely. So I go and pilfer through our herbal teas, and I make him and his lovely wife a glass of tea, and I hand it to him, and he sips it, and he goes, "What is this shite?"
I mean, if you offer an English person a cup of tea, and you give them a fruity tea.
I did.
You kind of deserve what you get.
Like, it's hibiscus, man.
You do, yeah. That is not what
that's on you.
Mistakes were made.
Like, don't get me wrong. I like all kinds of teas. But, like, this one is completely smooth, not bitter at all. It tastes really good. Like, I don't even have any cream and sugar in this. This is just really good.
Ooh.
Offer some black tea.
Yeah,
I learned
regular black.
That's a sin.
He was a former RAF pilot too, so he was highly insulted.
You are fortunate to be alive.
Yeah, he wasn't going to murder me. He was going to murder me. What are you having today?
Yeah, I'm also taking it a little easier recently because the holidays are in a few months, so I need to I want to get myself in a little better shape. Anyway, I've got this yellowtail. It's called the Pure Bright. It's like a low alcohol wine. I've got the Sauvignon Blanc, and it's very good and much easier on the belly. What about yourself?
I'm having a Hopium IPA. It's out from Foothills out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. One of my favorites.
Another local.
And it is delicious. So you guys crack your lame teas and wines open, and I will do the little splashy splash. Here we go. Everybody slurping. There we go. There we go. All right. So Duskmourn, House of Horrors. So this is a cool set.
Cool name.
It is. Like, I was excited. So
yeah.
Can we also just start off with the fact that I'm really glad that it has its own identity that's like extremely separate from Innistrad. And that was like one of my big concerns when the set was kind of initially teased about, where it was just like, okay, but are they just going to like kind of retread area that we've already been in, or are they going to be doing their own things? And I'm really glad that they did their own things.
I think that's a great point, because I think if we'd have just seen like, hey, here's some more werewolves, or hey, here's some more vampires, and I think that would have been, regardless of the mechanics, the flavor probably would have been a little underwhelming, but that is very, very far from the truth with this set, because the flavor, as well as we've got new mechanics, we've got revisited old mechanics, and the flavor as far as the art and what the cards are doing is like really on point.
It's created a tension with me, too, being a horror cube, specifically focusing on gothic horror.
Yeah.
As I make my choices, and we're going to talk about those soon, it's created its own set of challenges for me as a person trying to be a curator, because I'm trying to break some of my gothic horror molds and transfer over to that cosmic horror, if you will, 80s, 90s. May, you were saying?
Yeah, I was just going to add that there is an interesting overlap between how people like you who have horror cubes and how previous introductions of horror concepts have been put in, but now we have a little bit stronger of a way to break through outside of Eldrazi, and I really appreciate that. And I think that you've been searching a lot for that context too, and that's all that I wanted to add to your horror cube in particular, and I'm really hoping that, like, you're going to have a good selection of cards that coming out with this.
Yeah, I'm having to transition, say, from the, let's just say, Bram Stoker type of aesthetic and going in towards like the Stephen King or Lovecraftian type of ideas, or we'll just even see like a Clive Barker type of concept. It makes a little bit of a different vibe, and I like it.
It does. I think it's definitely on the darker side of the horror spectrum, if you will. Maybe even a little more on the, I don't know if I can say realistic fantasy, but I kind of feel that that's where it is. But one thing that's interesting, I love that you brought up Innistrad, because you have a horror cube, and I've met plenty of people at Cube Con or other events where they've talked about that they have like an Innistrad set. I don't want to say themed, but like focused maybe, horror type of cube. And I think this is going to be a big challenge for a lot of cube curators out there that have those kind of cubes, that maybe have created that cube because they wanted it to be like a horror kind of cube rather than a mechanically driven cube, because Innistrad was a wonderful set. How is this going to impact a lot of those other curators that have cubes that are designed around that space?
Yeah, it's hard to take like a Mary Shelley and then integrate it into, say, a Wes Craven. That is literally like a challenge that I'm going to experience, but I'm okay with it. I think I'm going to let the shields down and allow the air quotes cube to speak to me a little bit, to add some of these effects that they've added into this environment that I think will make the cube play a little better, a little less repetitive, a little bit more dynamic. There's opportunity here that I strongly feel is available.
Yeah, agree.
So kind of the gist, and this is one of the first times that I'm probably going to take the time to read the lore, because I'm excited to read this lore. I think it's such an interesting idea. As we talked about it, it's a plane that's become a house at the will of a demon, basically.
Yep.
And the house is spread across the entire, I guess, we'll say planet, for something we can all visualize, or plane. And it's preying on phobias.
Right.
So kind of these rooms or these quadrants or subsets each are based on some form of a phobia. And the phobias are just massive. Like some of them I leaned into, and some of them, they're very modernized. I think one of them was like FOMO. And I was actually like, should I put that in the Monopoly? But it doesn't play in such a way. But we'll talk about that as we move through.
Is there a FOMO phobia?
There is, feeling of missing out. It
yes, but is that an actual term, FOMOphobia? And if not, why not? And if so, then, well, here it is in a Magic set.
They made references to this set, which is interesting. Like I said, it's more modern. It's based kind of 80s, 90s horror tropes. And you can look at this either from like a movie perspective or like a writer perspective in my mind. But they really leaned into like referencing like Children of the Corn by Stephen King or The Blob. And I kind of want to talk about the Steve McQueen version, because I know some people referenced as they were younger than I am, and they reference like the 1980s or 1990s version of The Blob. But for me, it's the one where all the teenagers are dancing like beach blanket bingo style, and The Blob is in the theater. I recently watched that with my dog Odin, and we sat there, and I'm laughing my butt off, because I remember when I was like 8 years old, The Blob literally kept me up at night. My mom and dad walked in, and I think I was watching it on TBS at my aunt's house, and I had nightmares with the black and white version. So I sat down and I said, "Hey, Odin," he looks at me, little Australian Shepherd. We're going to crack a beer and we're going to get through this together, buddy. I'm like, this movie is stupid. Like,
Bit of emotional support.
Yeah, I needed my comfort dog.
Yeah.
But it felt like I was watching literally like Gidget or something like that. I'm like, oh my God, this movie's awful. But it was great. And then it's got these vibes of like Nightmare on Elm Street from Wes Craven. And it's got Hellraiser or Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. There's the Razor Skins and Needleheads, which is Pinhead.
I'm like a massive Hellraiser fan. I watch them all, like, I'll go through the series periodically just when I feel like going through them. So those kind of horror movies were my jam back in the day, and I still love watching them to this day.
Favorite horror movies? Sorry to interject myself. Tends to be along the lines of those kind of cheesy monster movies as well. I just find them really entertaining. Like, don't get me wrong, I can sit down with like scary stories to tell in the dark and whatnot and have like a pretty good time. But nothing quite beats the experience of sitting down and watching some cheesy horror movie with like some ridiculous over-the-top monster and just enjoying the over-the-top aesthetic of it. And I do really appreciate when we can get some of those more modern-themed monsters into a set. So I've been really excited for that.
They kind of leaned into The Ring because there's one card where a spirit is climbing out of a television. And then you've got what I believe is It, another Stephen King novel, which is amazing if you haven't read It. But The Jolly Balloon Man kind of reminds you of Pennywise a little bit. Yeah. It's got the vibe there going on. Then you got The Shining again with Stephen King, Unsettling Twins. This is cool stuff, you know, come play with us type stuff, I think is what it is. It's pretty creepy, right? A little side note, too. Stephen King did not like that. Was it Stanley Kubrick that did the first version?
The Shining?
He despised that first iteration because, like, even in the movie, in the version from The Shining, Jack Nicklaus has an axe. But in the book, I believe it was, what would you call it? It was the mallet that you used to play. What was the game you...
Croquet.
Croquet or croquette.
Crockett.
And then you got references to the Evil Dead.
I mean, you gotta love it, though, just from Jack Nicholson's performance. I mean, it's
it's excellent. It's stunning. But I remember Stephen King was really, like, not vibing with the idea of what they did.
And yes, Evil Dead, like, that's another one that has got a frequent position in my rotation. Both the first and the second. I like the third movie, but I loved the first and the second one. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I see you've got that one listed as well.
Yeah, Chainsaw's on there. So I made some assumptions.
It's got literally chainsaw in it.
Yeah, it's really cool. Yeah. And then we got some neat mechanics that kind of came out with
let's go through the mechanics, right? Let's start from the top. This one, first one, I must say, I think this type is the one thing that I've got most excited about. May, tell me how you feel about these rooms.
So I think the rooms are particularly neat. I think like I have a particular soft spot for modal spells to begin with, but having it, how do I put it? It kind of feels like those split cards mixed with, I dare to say, dungeon, in a way where you kind of start off with that initial choice where it's just like, okay, I'm going to start off by picking a room. And then I can pay additional mana to unlock the next room. And I love that. I think that there's a lot of like potential fun cube design that we can use for that in a way that dungeons couldn't do. And I really love that as a concept.
Yeah, one of the things that May and I were pre-gaming with, the rooms actually enticed me a little bit with the Monopoly, which is that desert cube that we're going to talk about here shortly. And the only thing that's holding me back from adding rooms to the Monopoly, because there's hotels, there's houses, right? And all these ideas is just the additional complexity that cube just simply, I don't believe, can handle.
I would agree with that.
At the time.
I think even from a flavor perspective, it may be a little bit of a stretch. Yeah. And I think it's in a good place right now. And I will say this about one of the things that I love about this and why I can't wait to see them. And sort of similarly for enchantments in other cubes is enchantments, unless the cube is designed in such a way to deal with them, enchantments can be one of the harder types of permanent to remove, right? There's typically a plenty amount of creature removal, some amount of artifact removal, but enchantment removal, if you've got something like that, and we'll go through some of the cards, the specifics of the cards as we go on, but that just to me is always a card type that I enjoy to pick because I always look at it and think that's typically a card type that is more difficult for my opponent to remove, and I'm going to get that persistent value from it.
Yeah, they're not.
Stu's absolutely right. Yeah. If your environment's kind of not tailored to have the appropriate answers for those enchantments, then it can be a really big obstacle. But I'll also say that if you're running an environment that's really enchantment focused, or what was that one called? The cube called where it had like that enchantments and
Scott Mertz.
Artifact overlap.
That's Scott Mertz. That's the Curio Cube. He actually posted
Curio
on
Cube.
Twitter today that he is, and that's one of the ones that we, well, I love that cube, and I'm so excited that's going to be featured at CubeCon 2024. He posted like
an environment like that
cards
perfectly supports rooms because when everybody has access to those tools, then it kind of helps balance it out.
Yeah.
The issue that I foresee being an issue coming up for some people's cubes is when people draft the room 1 or 2 room cards and then nobody else really has a way to answer it or match that type of modality. But maybe that's just a little bit of overly cautious.
No, I think that's.
Sorry,
that's your experience coming online.
I think that pessimism about their ability or their impact, I think, is necessary. I think you kind of have to have that about, especially when you've got a newer set that's come out where this is a new type. It's all fancy. Obviously, Wizards is going to slightly push things a little bit. We've seen some very strong rooms that have been spoiled already. So I think as a curator, you're going to look and think, oh, that's the fancy new shiny. I want to put it in there, but has the consideration been made as to the impact on the whole cube and the play experience?
What I wanted to mention was that the reason that I'm overly cautious is because it has the similar vibe to adventure cards, and I am a big fan of adventure cards. I think they're great. However, when you have something that has potential to essentially have a secondary card afterwards, you're essentially getting twice the amount of value per card that you're putting into your deck. And that can be difficult for some decks to overcome. I'm not going to be able to point to a specific example for the rooms yet, just because I haven't seen them in a cube yet. But I think that is something that we could keep in mind when we are putting them in, is that they're kind of comparable to adventures in that way.
If you have an adequate amount of disenchants or naturalize or Rec Sage type effects, then you can mitigate this risk. I think that's what we're ultimately saying is, they're new, they're splashy, they're fancy. The Curio Cube's going to be the perfect location for it.
Yeah.
Whereas when I go into the Artifact Cube, I start to challenge it because I tilt towards artifact removal, even though I do run let's say I run the Rec Sages, right? And I do have disenchant effects. I also go into the Manglehorn type of avenue or a Braid, right? And those cards simply can't deal with these. I think that's what we're really distilling down here. So it's a consideration while you're curating. People want to test new things. May said this in a most recent episode. You just want to make sure all the decks have adequate tools to be able to fight back. I mean, I think that's a fair statement.
Know what the advantage of these compared to adventure cards, though? The permanent is on the board. So even though you're selecting one half of it and then you can pay for the second half later, similar to adventures, your opponent can still interact with it. The biggest complaint with adventures is that once they're in exile, they're very difficult to interact with.
Yep.
Is that once they're on their stack, that's the only time that you can really interact once they're in exile. And it can be difficult to overcome a lot of that value. But if your environment's suitable for, like we've been mentioning, supporting these enchantments and making sure people have the right tools to accommodate those, they can actually be a way that you can shut down somebody's future value in a way that adventures just don't do. And I think that's good design. Yeah. I like that.
And then one of the ones is kind of leans into the graveyards matters type themes, or someone like me that has the Innistrad tropes or whatever, or in this case, if you support this set, Manifest Dread is like a combination of Manifest that came out recently, but now you get to look at the top 2 cards of your library. Then you manifest one of them face down as a 2/2, which has no like distinguishable types except for it's called, I believe, a creature, but has no creature types, no color, no association. And then that creature has no name, no abilities attached to it, and another one goes to your graveyard, which is pretty sick. So that really
full disclosure
fills your graveyard.
We were talking a bit earlier before we started the episode about whether or not there were cards that I was actually excited for in Duskmourn. I lied. There are. Specifically the Dread cards, because I have my Shadow Game Cube, which is all just a bunch of morph manifest whatevers. And these are like the epitome of shadowy things that manifest Dread, and it's perfectly on theme. It perfectly does the thing that my Shadow Game Cube does, and I'm so excited for them.
It's such a really like dynamic type of mechanic that I'm so excited to actually try this out. And it's going to find homes all the way from powered vintage down to thematic builds. It doesn't have to just go into Graveyards Matters. It's just so neat. And then the next one we're meeting is Eerie. It triggers whenever an enchantment enters or you unlock a room. So that's a lot more in my mind, towards the enchantment type cubes, and or it's geared towards like whenever you're retail drafting this set.
Right.
Right. And they got to have a certain amount of that. Another one that's really cool is impending. It's like a reverse suspend. And the reason why I say that, it's an alternative casting cost, but the creature or whatever it is enters with time counters on it that remove at the end step. So I think it's really neat versus upkeep, I believe, with suspend, right?
Yeah, suspend is upkeep, and it's basically exiled with those counters on it. So if you suspend something, you exile it.
On the board.
This enters. So one of the ones that we'll talk about, so for example, a creature, it still enters the battlefield. It's just not a creature if you cast it for its impending cost. So any ETBs, any of that kind of stuff, they're all going to happen.
And they're enchantment types, but I may actually remove that, but I believe I'm correct on that too. Mm-hmm. So they're interesting.
Wouldn't it be more like reverse fading?
Yeah, that's probably a better statement. Yeah, you're right. It's fading, not suspend, because it's on the board,
because
it's on the field.
Instead of your creature like leaving play as soon as your counters run out, it becomes like an actual creature once the counters run out.
Yeah, that's a much better point.
A slow bestow.
See, this is why May is there. Yeah. This is why when you talk about the best, I look at her and not me.
Another one too that is weird is the
just
survival.
A casual shade throwing at Anthony.
Myself.
I see how it is.
No, that's at myself.
Magic is hard. It's a hard game. Survival is one that's actually almost like changed a lot of erratas, but I think people put the kibosh on this one. But it was if a creature is tapped on your second main phase, then you get a benefit. So it's encouraging you to get into a vehicle or actually attack in.
Or attack, yeah.
And then at the beginning of your second main, you now get a thing. That's something we're not used to. That's really neat. That's going to cause a lot of it's going to make people stop and look at that tree when we first learned Magic. You went through those steps and you didn't pay attention to it and you went untap, upkeep, blah, blah, blah. And you went down the steps, right? And people are just kind of just peruse through it. Now you're going to get a lot of wait a minute, pause. Because we're always used to saying at the beginning of combat, I'm moving to combat. Now we're saying I'm moving to the beginning
of my
second
main.
Announcing.
What I do like about survival?
Yeah.
I really like how backward compatible it is. Like what you were saying with the vehicles, I think that is the perfect example for the backward compatibility of this mechanic. Where we see it with Inspired, which is just an okay mechanic, right? But this feels like the much better version of that.
Yeah.
And if you have things that rely on your creatures tapping and whatnot during your main phase 1 in order to enable your more aggressive or proactive plays, then there's a lot of previous mechanics that this just works perfectly with. Like, if we take it into account with, the mounts from... What's the set called? I already forgot.
Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Yeehaw!
Yeah, thank you. Yeehaw! Point is that we have a few different mechanics that it can go back with, and I think that will really help cube curators just find new homes for some of the cards that you might have overlooked before.
And then we've got some returning that capitalizes off of these ideas. We've got Delirium, which is 4 more card types in a graveyard. We've got a little bit of Morbid, a splash of Morbid, if not 1 card, I believe. And then we have one with Undying, which we're going to talk about. And these are some of Morbid and Undying are some of my S tier type. They're right there with Flashback for me.
What are we talking about these cards in particular about with today's episode? Obviously, we want to highlight them a little bit, but there's a certain event coming up very soon. And we're going to touch a little bit on the impact that these are going to have on our very own Uber Bears cubes that will be showcased at Cube Con. Tell us a little bit about the cubes that you like, that you think are going to be mostly impacted by these cards.
Yeah, so CubeCon has done us a solid, and thank you, CubeCon. We're excited, and we're going to be there. And one of the things that they've done is they've extended, the cutoff date for changes because they knew Duskmourn was coming out, and there's a lot of cool tech that's coming out. And as part of this episode is we don't have a lot of playtesting time. Stu and I are actually busy. We can't play tonight type thing. That's what we're dealing with. I wanted to bring the group in here to talk about some of my choices, in particular for my CubeCon preps. And the 3 cubes that are featured at CubeCon this year that I would be so happy if you play and if you're listening is going to be Uber Bear's Artifact Cube, the Monopoly, which is my twist on the Desert Cube environment where I focus on treasures, and it's the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. It's all economics based. And then the one that I'm most honored for is the Femme that was chosen by Birds of Paradise Bop to be featured. And I want to kind of talk about the cards from Duskmourn with both May and Stu to get their opinions on whether or not it should or should not go in, because I have, just like everyone else is going to encounter, very limited amount of time for testing. So here we are. In addition to that, we're going to splash in a little bit of, because This set is primarily driven by my horror cube. That would be what you would expect for us to talk about, and we will talk about that because we're going into the month of October. It is the spooky season. And we will touch lightly upon a few considerations I have for the Empower environment, but I'm going to mostly focus on the 3 cubes that are featured because I've got these 2 experts in the room, and I would love listener participation as we call these out.
On the Twitters.
Yes.
On the emails.
On the Discord. Please take a look at my cubes, and they will be included in the show notes. Tell me if we got it right, because I have no time for testing. This is all theory crafting at this point, and I just want to know if the fit is right.
I want to talk about a line that we've got in our show notes, and we always encourage our readers, go to the Discord, check out the show notes. It shows the subjects, it shows the cards that we're talking about. But you've got here a line, minor tweaks, unsettling the environment. Is this the commonality between these cards and the cubes that you've just mentioned, right? The ones that you're taking to Cube Con. The Artifact Cube, the Fem Cube, and the Monopoly Cube. Do you feel like this is what that has done? This has just unsettled things a little bit? Do you think that it's caused tension in certain archetypes or card choices? Do you think they've been very complementary to the cubes and they've sort of fit in naturally? What's been the process there? And I'll open that up to both of you guys, because obviously you're both very successful, globally famous curators. I'd like to hear... And this is probably going to apply to any set, right? But I understand that this is so thematic, and really because of that Innistrad kind of thing, and how other Innistrad horror cubey curators out there might see a set like this.
So I would say I'm going to start with this one: the Artifact Cube, the Monopoly, and the Fem. I feel confident they are in healthy places,
right?
But in tradition of what I've done every year, we've joked about this on multiple, I always add in a wild card at the last second.
So this is a shaking things up
It's a shaking things up.
Right.
And specifically with the Artifact Cube, this is the 3rd time it's featured at CubeCon, and it's been at every one since. There's a meta that has been formed. And I'm trying to, I guess, reform that meta, so I'm okay with shaking it up a little bit. I don't want players to go in, like Selesnya 2 years ago was believed to be the dominant, and it was proven to be the dominant control mechanism. Then we come back the second year, and the theory is that I could just ride the lightning on Selesnya, and it didn't necessarily prove 100% true. Well, this year I've shaken it up even more, and I've made blue, and we're going to talk about this a lot more, but I've had a chance to kind of reflect upon that with intent, and I'm shaking it up a little bit, right? So that when they sit down at CubeCon 2024, that all the tools you saw the years before, or what you heard about the cube, or the expectation, good, bad, or indifferent, I want to shake it up a little bit. So.
All right, I'll put the same thing to you then, May. What do you think? What's your vibe as you look through the spoilers for this set? Do you feel like these are cards that are complementing your cubes, that they're shaking up dynamics within the cube? What's your feeling about it?
So, I only have the fake cube that's going in. But I also have the Shadow Game cube for the Bar Cube, and they're completely different vibes in terms of where they're going to be played. So with the fake cube, I just don't think that there's going to be any cards that are going to be good fits. Like, I've been kind of eyeballing some of the toy cards, just because I think that they could apply, but I've been overlooking them in terms of what the fake cube's doing. I'm more looking at them in terms of what am I looking for the Shadow Game cube, because that is where we're going to have people drinking, hanging out, having a good time, and then seeing these weird Shadow Game vibe type creatures coming out, right? And my biggest frustration is that there's just not enough cards that I want, so I'm hoping that we might be able to see more, maybe, with the Commander products. I don't know, but...
Okay, that's fair. I mean, yeah, that's kind of what
There's not really any major shakeups that I'm seeing. I think one of my main complaints at the moment is that there are a good number of cards that manifest dreads that are in the rare slots or in the mythic slot that are definitely too strong for that environment. But I don't know. It's hard. It is a hard to assess mechanic. So.
Agree.
Which leads me to my challenges. I'm going to kick off with the Artifact Cube.
Let's go.
Is 3rd time around. I'm going to shake things up. Here we go. Get that beanbag. Let's shake it up. Here we go. Right. So I'm going to start out with this first card, and I want the opinion of both of you as I travel. I'm considering this card, and I'm just going to put down, like, when I added these cards, these are just like, I'm putting a pin in it. I think it could make it in the environment. Not certain. And for those that run like the Curio Cube, or people that run like artifact effective cubes, or in this case, like a horror genre cube, this card will apply. And we're going to start out with It's a Room.
Yes. Let's be clear, first of all. So rooms are the new type. They're basically like a two-parter, right?
Right.
And you'll get the left-hand side of the card, which you cast, and then you can get, a static ability or whatever in the case of the one that we're going to talk about. And then there's this right side of the card, which you can also gain the ability of, but you also need to cast that side of the card, right? So you can cast one side and then you cast the other one. This one is super cool. Tell us about it.
So Dollmaker Shop is the left-hand side of the card, as we'll refer to, or the bottom of the card if you turn the card up. And it's going to be for one colorless and a plains. You get an enchantment room. And then the first part, if you cast it, whenever one or more non-toy creatures you control attack a player, create a 1/1 white toy artifact creature token. That's the first half. The second half is Porcelain Gallery. For 4 colorless and 2 plains, you get a creatures you control have base power and toughness, each equal to the number of creatures you control. So an Anthem type effect.
Correct.
I'm trying to decide if White would like this. It's an enchantment. Yeah, you agree?
I would draft it.
You would draft it, okay. I think it's dynamic. And so I wanted to ask you specifically, May. We've talked about this before, where I've latched onto too many things in the past because, as a side note, it says, and by the way, it makes an artifact. And you've kind of referenced before in the past, you've said, oh, sweet summer child.
Yeah.
But you think the juice is worth the squeeze in this one?
I do think it is, because one of the main obstacles that you've been having is making that kind of identity for decks that turn sideways, and I think that this is a good way to go into that direction for a good payoff, because the issue at the moment is that we have your 3-drop slots that are extremely powerful, and this being a 2-drop that generates more of those creatures every time that you attack, and there's not a lot of 1-drops in your environment. It has the potential to sit in your hand, but you kind of have a live the dream environment anyways. So I think that this in combination, like with, say, an aggro Orzhov package, could be really spicy in your environment in a way that's very fun and interesting.
I would agree. And this card, the first thing that's interesting to me, and I'm looking at this through the whole scope, right, of Magic and cards that are available for your cube, the condition on this card is whenever one or more non-toy creatures you control attack a player, right? So in 99% of the cubes that this is going to see playing, right, what this actually reads is whenever you attack, create a 1/1 artifact creature. That's it. The non-toy is irrelevant. The one or more is a condition, right? But it's not really a condition, because if you're attacking, you're probably attacking with one creature. So it just means all you need to do is attack. And it's dang cheap. It's 2 mana value for this persisting effect. Again, in typically a permanent type that is not as easy to remove as things like creatures and artifacts. So I think even if you just ignore the second half of this card, I actually think the 1 and a white is bonkers good, even as it is. I don't want to go out and start saying that this is going to start playing vintage cube environments necessarily, but it wouldn't surprise me. This is early on.
I'd be very happy playing a 1-drop into 2-drop into this.
I would
That's a lot of value.
I would feel the same way. Skull Clamp decks rejoice. Skull Clamp players rejoice right now. I
completely forgot how it would go in Skull Clamp decks. I mean, that's essentially turn sideways and then sclamp something every turn.
Exactly. Attack with your creature that is skull clamped, and then maybe it dies, and then maybe you just get the skull clamped to 1/1, and you're just drawing cards. Cards go brrr.
Cards do go brrr.
Okay, so I
do have one small complaint with this card, and it is not going to be relevant for a majority of cubes, but I find it really funny and sad that we're having a second case where we're introducing this thing in this general archetype that you're trying to support. So previously it was with Cult Conscripts, I think it was called, where it was a skeleton.
Yeah.
But then it only synergizes when a non-skeleton dies.
Right. I'm gonna have
having the same problem here.
I'm gonna
where
have
it's
my
like
own
this is
token
clearly a
challenges
toy
with
card.
this one too.
It references being a toy card, everywhere except for the effect.
Yep.
And that's my only complaint.
So this next one, Stu and I were pre-gaming a little bit. This was Fire in the Sky. We were looking up the movie tropes.
Yeah, I mean, look, Fire in the Sky, classic early 90s movie. It's actually based on a true story about this guy, Travis, that gets abducted by aliens, and they interviewed him and his friends, and he went missing, and all kinds of real not very nice things apparently happened to him, according to his recollection. So this is unidentified hover ship. This is 1 colorless, 2 white for an vehicle. It's a 2/2 flying. When unidentified hover ship enters, exile up to 1 target creature with toughness 5 or less. Very interesting. Whenever unidentified hover ship leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner manifests dread. And it's crew 1 for a 2/2 flyer. Not bad. With a really, really strong ability attached to it. So I think this is really, really good. Just the flavor is off the charts for this like kind of horror theme set.
The flavor.
Yeah, I wonder if the WotC people, the designers on this one, was like Supernatural fans.
They picked their favorite movies.
Because there's an episode where they're bringing all the tropes to life.
Absolutely. They picked their favorite movies. And it's like, hey, this is the art concept that we've got, or this is what we want the card to do. So yeah.
I do really appreciate that this has flying because it really makes it stand out compared to a lot of the other Fiend Hunter effects. Like, we've had a lot of Fiend Hunter style cards, but having it on this, like, we've had a vehicle type of Fiend Hunter effect before with a Mysterious Limousine at 5 mana, I think it was. But this being at 3 mana, which makes it at the same rate as the other Fiend Hunter types cards, with flying will actually make it have its own unique area compared to the rest of the Fiend Hunters, and I think that that's worth notating.
I agree, and toughness 5 or less, I mean, that might as well just be exile target creature, right? I mean, it's hit such a massive variety. Maybe in some really, really slower, like all the creature toughnesses are very, very high, then I could maybe see that as a bit of a limitation, but I really don't see that 5 toughness as a limitation necessarily.
And it pushes into that survival mode with that particular mechanic they had where you want that creature tapped at your second main. So that's pretty genius.
This next one I want to
steal their flyer, and now you have a 2/2 to keep pressure on. You're
exactly.
welcome.
This next one, all right, we talked about this again in the pregame. So this is Clockwork Percussionist. This is 1 red for an artifact creature, Monkey Toy. It's a 1/1 with haste, and when it dies, exile the top card of your library. You may play it until the end of your next turn. I think that's a really nice effect at 1 mana. Even just a 1 mana 1/1 haste is nice, but that added ability is really cool. And the art has got very like Blade Runner kind of, vibes with all the toys that, and I'm terrible sometimes for names of actors, but anyway, the dude with the hat that lives in the place that,
He lives in the place in the Blade Runner.
Yeah, exactly. And I love the actor. He's incredible. He's in Deadwood. He's the man. But just, this is a really, really, and again, for the artifact cube, it just fits in so beautifully. It's an artifact. It's an aggressive card. You have that very, very red effect of being able to exile the top card of your library and playing it until the end of your next turn, which I always love. The end of this turn is always so limiting. I want this side
to like Bombot Courier. That's how this feels to me, right? Like it's a good, like different aggression style.
Well, I think that's more even future value, but I don't know. Maybe this is like secretly skullclamp.set, right? Because you just bring it in, attack for 1, skull clamp it. Now you've got 2 cards, and you can play one of the, the exile card until the end of turn. So I'm making my decision now. This is skullclamp.set.
And let's go ahead and put a pin in it right now. Pause. Skull Clamp is not in the artifact cube. Do not be hunting that down because Stu has said it twice now.
I have.
This next card is going into the Doom Cube.
It should be in there.
Well, I can't take this one, but we're going to put this in the artifact cube. But I'm giving this to Stu. Doom Cube vibes.
Yeah, I mean, it's Chainsaw, and obviously anyone who's played Doom will know that the Chainsaw is like one of the iconic weapons in the game. So this is another artifact equipment, 1 and a red. When it enters, it deals 3 damage to up to 1 target creature. Whenever 1 or more creatures die, you put a rev counter on Chainsaw, and the equipped creature gets +X+0, where X is the number of rev counters on Chainsaw, and it's equipped 3. Again, this is a pretty solid, it gets the 3 damage when it ETBs, right? That's pretty nice, just for two, right? If you've killed a creature, now it's got a rev counter on it. Equip 3 for just +1/+0 is a little bit on the slow side, but I think just for flavor, it's absolutely off the charts. I think power level is okay, but again, flavor, just through the roof. Very cool.
if you already have a package that cheats the equip costs anyways, this is like a slam dunk for those.
I probably do. But let's go over this.
You don't have cheap ways to get a skull clamp.
100% do. No skull clamp.
No? Okay.
This one here is the one that I put on the list. This card is going to end up in multiple cubes. I don't know if it's going to go into the artifact cube. And it's going to be Twitching Doll. And I think this is one of the first ones they spoiled. And everybody's like, oh my gosh, this card's amazing. And for one colorless and a forest, you get an artifact creature spider toy. I hate spiders. Like, I'm arachnophobic. If there was a room on Duskmourn, it would be a spider room, and I'm just dead. And it's a 2/2, and you can tap it. Add 1 mana of any color, put a nest counter on Twitching Doll. Tap, sacrifice Twitching Doll, create a 2/2 green spider creature token with reach for each counter on Twitching Doll. Activate only as a sorcery.
Let's point this out first of all, right? So it's a 2 mana dork, right? That taps for any color, which is very good. But the second ability is for each counter. Not nest counter, not +1/+1 counter, any counter. So this has got quite strong ability in any cube that supports any kind of counters, proliferate, any of that kind of stuff. This could be very good. And I do want to point out, you're absolutely correct. This was one of the first cards spoiled. And from an artistic perspective, one of the things that was so interesting and hilarious to me in a way was I saw the comments when this card was released, and a lot of people said something on a similar kind of level, which was they saw this card and thought, oh my gosh, look at this cute little doll toy cat thing. And then I looked closer, and then I see, oh, it's called a spider toy. And then I looked even closer, and then I realized that the entire toy is made out of spiders, and it's all gross. Those little dots and marks that seem to be coming off it, they're not just creases in whatever the curtain or blanket that thing is holding up. Those are also spiders, and this is quite literally, as Anthony has mentioned, his stuff of nightmares. But again, flavor off the charts. Very good to be able to just put a 2 mana dork in that taps for any color, and does have a really, really good relevant ability to be able to sack something to get creatures with reach, and as many of them as you're able to tap counters. And the fact that you're adding counters by tapping it for any color of mana, this card is very, very strong.
Small ramble. I 100% agree with Stu, by the way. But my small ramble is about, I find it really nice that as we've started to enter, well, I guess we haven't started to enter, but we've been in a sort of commander card renaissance, if you will, where we have so many cards that are unnecessarily put into a lot of these sets that are like worded specifically for commander. But there is an upside to it, and that's why I wanted to notate it here. When we have a card like this that has this generic requirement, and I really feel like Wizards has done a good job in recent sets of making things dynamic, approachable, and flexible. That flexibility makes it so that way this is the type of card that can fit into a lot of different packages. If you have a set that revolves around, say, a bunch of the counters from Ikoria, or a bunch of +1/+1 counters, you have a lot of homes for a card like this.
Very
and
organic.
I think that can't go overstated.
Yes.
And like, imagine if you put this in a cube with a lot of the things that cared about, like modified cards, right? Where we have something that, yes, we have this overarching idea or name or whatever we assign to it, but it's generic enough that it can fit into a lot of different baskets, and I think that it's good design.
I agree, 100%. Great card design. And, you know, we've had our thoughts, criticisms at time, compliments at time about the way that we've seen some of these cards and the design perspective of Wizards and what they've been putting out in the last few sets. We've complained about power creep. We've complimented this type, or so on and so forth. Really do think that this just is one of the cards that I would highlight out of this set that is just really knocking it out the park on so many different levels. Flavor is incredible. The power level, I think, is really nice. Great cube card. I think it'll be a fantastic limited card. I think it's an unbelievable cube card. I think Commander players will be eating it up as well. I just think this is fantastic. This may be my favorite card in the set.
I would agree. Here's my next dangerous card, and one, every time I go to Cube Con,
CEDH players are salivating about this one, I'm sure. And probably a lot of Cube curators out there.
It's going to be Marvin, the Murderous Mimic. For 2 colors, get a legendary artifact creature toy. Marvin has all activated abilities of creatures you control that don't have the same name as this creature, aka Marvin for a 2/2.
Can I just mention that Marvin has got this big head but a small body? Do you think he's hungry? Do you think you could even say that he's starving?
Yeah, it's so gross. It's so uncomfortable. I'm going to put this, so we're going to skip ahead, and I'm going to add this into my horror cube. Same thing with the spider toy that we talked about before. But this is a card that I've got on my list right now. I need to evaluate the impact to this environment. Right now, I just saw it. Spoiler season finished up today, Friday the 13th. I'm adding this card. I have to make a determination of how broken this card is because it has the potential to be extremely broken. So TBD on this one.
I'm going to be devil's advocate with this. If you are in a position that you already have all of these creatures with these activated abilities, I think that you're already in a winning position. I think that this kind of reads as, yes, this is a fun Johnny Jenny potential live the dream moment. There's ways that we can exploit it. There's ways that we could do dirty things. But if you're in the position that you already have a lot of those things on the board, then this is just kind of the nail in the coffin card to close it off. Like, I put it in a lower regard than, like, say, what was that one Mer called? It enters, it imprints cards from the graveyard, artifacts from the graveyard specifically.
Don't know. Scryfall?
You know what I'm talking about.
I do know.
That card is a little better because it's harder to interact with the graveyard. So when you're setting up things into the graveyard, by the time that you get that gotcha card on there, it's too late. And I feel like that there's going to be this kind of interesting push and pull that you're going to have with this card where, yes, it has the potential to be the final piece to the puzzle to do the whole combo and completely the run of the game. But if your opponents let you get to that position, then they were losing anyways.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I'll also come from the perspective of I don't necessarily think you're always looking at this as like the missing piece. I actually think a lot of the times you may be looking at this as like the complementary piece or the redundancy piece. I think this is very, very, very strong. I really do. I think having all activated abilities of all creatures, again, I really do think it's going to be seen more as a secondary redundancy piece rather than I need this final piece. But we'll see. I mean, it's going to be so different for however many cubes that it's in, right? Because obviously, activated abilities, there's a gazillion of them out there. So however you choose to build your cube and what you choose to put in there as far as activated abilities. But now having that piece of redundancy, I think could be quite interesting.
Also stealing your opponent's activated abilities on creatures.
Exactly.
So the fact that it's only your own, I feel like that they probably reeled it back because they were like, oh, actually, this has a lot of potential to be too strong. So
it's similar to Heaven Go Lich. That's one of the cards that does this. But my fear is with a card like this is pairing it with something like Metalworker. So now you've basically got the ability to just empty your entire Browntown hand, and Metalworker's already busted, but now it's double busted.
Merwelder.
Yeah.
Merwelder was who I was trying to think
of. So it has potential. I'm willing to try it out. I just think that I'm definitely walking a line with this card a little bit. It's dangerous. This is going to be my dangerous card that I'm going to introduce to the environment. And I am going to study it a little bit to see like all the hits, because I think that is something I must do. The Dissection Tools, however, is another card that I am examining also for the Horror Cube. But for 5 colors, you get an artifact equipment. When Dissection Tools enters Manifest Dread, then attach Dissection Tools to that creature. So it attaches itself to a creature. So it has the vibes of Batterskull, right? A quick creature gets +2/+2, has Death Touch, and lifelinks, minus the Vigilance.
Yeah.
Yep. And equip, sacrifice a creature. I think this is a great card. I think it's a good little top end.
I agree.
Yeah, I think it has potential. So I'm curious what this can do. Stu, what do you think about this card?
I agree. I think it's on a similar kind of power scale that Batterskull is on. I think it's going to be a cool, fun card for the Artifact Cube. I think this is going to be the equip sacrifice a creature. I actually think is really awesome, right? I think anytime there's abilities of cards that allow you to use these kind of alternative ways of activating things and casting things and stuff like that. I always think it makes things interesting, makes cards interesting. So that to me is very fun. And I think it's a really good card. I think 5 mana makes it very fair. I think a 2/2 Death Touch and Lifelink is no joke. That's never going to be easy to deal with. Well, maybe with your Artifact Cube, because you got a fair amount.
It has the potential to do unfair things.
Correct.
But at 5 mana, it feels very fair in the context of Cube.
Yeah, and fragile enough that I think it's going to be fair. So I like it. Yeah. It's not an overwhelming card by any stretch, in my opinion. I mean, it's Death Touch and Lifelink, and those things might have been scary. Certainly, Death Touch might have been scary to me after 3 weeks of me playing Magic. But nowadays, I just look at it as okay. It doesn't have Vigilance or Trample. If it attacks, I can chump and sacrifice it, or there's ways to deal with those kind of effects. So I think it's cool, but I think it's just that.
It's got a weird kind of like mixture of Batterskull meets Grafted War Gear.
Yeah,
and I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
So let's move over. That's the Artifact Cube, and that's featured at CubeCon 2024. And I'm going to go through that list and see what I can and can't do. So next up for being featured is the Monopoly. And that we've talked about it before. We're going to talk about it on a primer episode coming soon. But that is my environment where treasures are kind of the lean in. And it's really like flavor forward. And everything is about like economics. And this first card, straight up silly. It's not good. I'm just going to say that. But I think it's funny. And it made me laugh. And it leans into what I want to do. And it's going to be Piggy Bank. For 1 colorless and 1 mountain, you get an artifact creature, Boar Toy. When Piggy Bank dies, create a treasure token for a 3/2. It's just silliness. It's a piggy bank. It's economics. It's saving. What do you think?
It's a 3/2 for 2. It does not have haste. If it did, it would be absolutely bonkers broken. But do you know how good this would be with a... You've got Skull Clamp in there, right? So with Skull Clamp... All right, never mind. You don't have Skull Clamp. But...
You and your Skull Clamp.
I know, but
I think
there's
it's
just
fine.
so many of these cards,
I think it's fine. Like, having just a boring card that makes a treasure when it dies for 2 mana is sometimes just necessary. Sometimes it's important to have the important, not grease cards.
I actually think that's
filler
a great
cards.
term.
Filler is the word I'm looking for.
I think grease is great, right? It's not the glue, but it is the grease. I actually think grease is fantastic. I think that's a fantastic term
it's
for a card
the grease
like that.
of your environment where if you just need to have enough ways that you can make treasures and have an incidental thing, because you're always going to have the 15th card of the pack. And I think that this is a perfectly fine card to have as one of those 15th cards of the packs, because people aren't going to feel bad drafting this. It's just they're going to tend to overlap it for, bigger, splashier, more interesting things.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think that's on point. And also, outside of very high power cubes, I don't think there's many times where I'm particularly mad about drafting a 2 mana creature that has 3 power. Like, just that by itself makes it... That's a bit of gravy.
And a little bit of a note, it'll be the 18th card of the pack, because players are going to draft 3 packs of 18.
It ain't going to be the 18th card in the pack if I'm drafting. Let me tell you. I'm slamming
It's aggressive, it's a true drop, and it's in red.
Exactly.
It does all the things that you're wanting to do. It doesn't need to be exciting.
The next one is kind of my meta grab here a little bit, and we'll see what May has to say about this one. So it's grab the prize. For 1 colorless and 1 red, you get a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card. Draw 2 cards. If you discarded a card that wasn't a land, grab the prize, deals 2 damage to each opponent, being the opposing opponent 1v1. I recently have embedded this Exile Matters type thing. I'm running the Construct that capitalizes on that. I'm running Squee that capitalizes on that. Bag of Holding that capitalizes on that, because I got that feedback from Capital Cube Championships that I have all this red Exile and they wanted something that they could do with it. And for me, the meta grab here a little bit is you've now opened up Community Chest, or you've opened up Chance, and they're not always good. Sometimes they're bad. And I just thought this card was neat because it has a little bit of push and pull to it. May, flavor perspective?
I think the flavor's a miss. But I think mechanically it would be a good fit. But that's just my opinion.
What do you think of Grab the Prize, Stu?
I agree. I don't think the flavor is quite there for a Monopoly cube, because the cube typically does revolve around cards that have resource-based either abilities, something along those lines that really stick out as a Monopoly kind of card. The art isn't really there. I don't love it for that cube. Put it that way. Okay. I don't love it.
All right, so now we're going into the difficult cube, the one that's always been the challenge, the third cube that's featured at CubeCon 2024, which is the Fem. And again, shout out to Bob. Thank you for choosing it. This first card that I've added, I am uncertain. I put it in last second. I don't know if I'm going to put this in. May, would you mind taking this one away, please? I'm undecided.
So it's the Wandering Rescuer, 3 white, for a legendary creature, human samurai noble, 3/4 with flash and convoke. Double strike and other tapped creatures you control have hexproof. We've had a lot of these type of flash savior things type cards before, but convoking 5 mana is significant enough of a cost where, yes, I love convoke and there are places for it, but I feel like that it can lead to a lot of situations where this is cards either sitting in your hand because it's just like, great, I have a flash double striker that I can just kind of bring in, maybe eat something, which is pretty good. Or best case scenario of I flash it in, save my board, and completely run you over next turn. And whether or not you want that kind of swinginess in terms of utility, I guess that's something that you should consider, but I think that it might be worth experimenting with at the very least.
Yeah, so this was a last edition ad, mostly because of the tap creatures you control have hexproof. Like, I am, at this point in my cube curation, I'm avoiding indestructible, I'm avoiding protection, I'm avoiding hexproof. And the only thing that's the saving grace is other tapped. So at this point, I added it because I do want to represent the character of the Wanderer, which I think is an amazing character. I'm just uncertain if this card is too much. Like you said, it feels a lot like a counterspell or something that's very reactive, and players might get a little like entangled as to when to put this down. They should be marching forward. They should just get this down as soon as they can, convoke it out. I don't know if it's just going to create like weird tension in your hand.
I just feel like that there's a good potential that they might just sit in somebody's hand, or it'll completely blow your opponent out.
I think I agree with you. It wasn't something that I'm super excited to add, which is kind of like this next one. This next one is another card that I put on the list, mostly because it does demonstrate femme characters. I don't know if the cube can handle it. It's one of those cards, like when you add it, I'm wondering if I should support this more. This would be, I wish this art was a little different, to be frank with you. Like, this would be perfect, like in my horror cube, where it's still perfect in Sandwich's, I guess, his bug cube.
Right.
Because he doesn't actually care about the art as much as he cares about the effect, because it's very graveyard centric. Mine is very gothic horror in the horror cube, and it's going to be the Deluge of Doom. For 2 colorless and 1 black, you get a sorcery. All creatures get -X until the end of the turn, where X is the number of card types among cards in your graveyard. This card, I put it on the list because I struggle to get board wipes that meet my flavor expectations, right? I get the occasional Wrath of God or whatever, but it's so far in between that I just wanted to talk about this card. What do you think about it? Like, from, you're familiar with the cube.
I don't really know how I feel about it, because X is the number of card types among cards in your graveyard. For the most part, when I'm looking at cards like that, I'm really looking at the rest of my understanding of how the cube operates and how my deck could potentially operate to see how well I can support that. It's at 3 mana, which is really good, right? So it's in line with like a Toxic Deluge, similar-ish kind of effect, except Toxic Deluge lets you pay life, and this allows you to count the card types in your graveyard. So I don't hate it, because any way that you have to wrath a board for only 3 mana is very, very strong. I think it really comes down to, again, what are you trying to utilize this card to do, right? Are you just trying to give black the ability to be able to wrath the board? Do you also have an ability within that color, or a color pair, or even a triple color, where that is something that you expect those color pairs or that wedge to be able to do? is fill the graveyard. And typically black is able to do that. So I think it can have a pretty decent power level as well, where I think it's going to have a strong effect on the graveyard. But it really does come down to that flavor. And I'm not still quite sure that from a flavor perspective that it really hits the mark, because I think you've done such a careful job for the rest of that cube, right? From an artistic perspective, which is really what the cube is about. You have really tried hard to stay true to a theme. And I'm not convinced that artistically that it fits in that cube.
No, I agree 100%. Like, I put it on the list for, I guess, the deliberation purposes. But right now I have the Bantu version of this, which I do support that character. And it causes your lands to tap whenever you do the board wipe at 3.
It does.
It sets you back. And I was looking at this as a potential, but I don't support any kind of self-mill. Reanimator is very, like, I guess it's reactive, not proactive.
I think Bantu's Last Reckoning. Is
Yes.
that right?
Yeah,
I think that's a pretty underrated card, to be honest. Like, not being able to...
I will note you
untap
do
kinda
have fetch
sucks,
lands.
and there you go.
I do. So it gets weird. Maybe we'll talk about this one offline. I'm trying to figure out if this deserves a spot. I feel like this card
I think you
is
need to put
defensive.
this up on the Twitters.
Yeah, I think so.
And
too.
just try and get some more input. I still believe that from a flavor perspective, within the scope of the cube, I'm not 100% convinced that it's really on theme enough because of how careful you've been up until this point. But I would still like to see it from just a mechanical perspective. You have some consideration for this card. Let's see what other people think.
I agree.
Okay. This next one, too, is a maybe. Or these are all maybes at this point, right? Because this is the one that I'm treading very lightly. Again, these cubes are very healthy right now. The addition of these cards aren't via necessity. I'm doing it for the change up, right? And what's interesting is, I said this before, the Artifact Cube has a meta formed around it. There's an expectation. The Monopoly and the Fem have never been to Cube Con. There is no meta formed around these, with the exception of the few players like Capital Cube Championships and UberCubeathon that have experienced these cubes, and if they show up, otherwise there's no built-in, like, Selesnya wins, right? And that's kind of the differentiation here between these ideas as I try to do these change-ups and how much change-ups are necessary. This next one is Gleeful Arsonist, and I'm interested in this one mostly because of the Undying factor. I just love Undying. Like, this card pulled me in. And it's for 2 colorless and 1 red. You get a creature, human wizard. And I have abilities to capitalize off of wizards, too. We've talked about this during an episode. And whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, Gleeful Arsonist deals damage equal to its power to that player for a 1/2. So it's opponent dependent. I'm not certain this card has the payoff, but it does get around board wipes, etc., right?
I will say, I do not think that the juice is worth the squeeze with this card, because typically, and we've drafted this Fem cube a lot of times, it's probably my favorite cube of yours, period. I love this cube. I don't know if the juice is quite worth the squeeze at 3 mana in a color where I'm typically trying to be aggressive. Flavor-wise, the art is really awesome, but I just think purely from a mechanical perspective, this card is cool. I think in a limited environment, it's a maybe, because again, exactly like you said, you're relying on your opponents doing things to really get max damage. And I just think a 3 mana 1/2 with Undying is a little bit underwhelming for me. If it was put to me, I wouldn't include this in the cube. I like the art, but I don't really like the card.
It's a commander card. I think that's its biggest detriment.
Agreed.
If this was just like a hypothetical commander deck that you were building, yeah, sure, absolutely, slam it in. But it's not. I don't think that its Punisher ability is relevant enough in your environment. Yes, you have about a 50-50 split in terms of creatures and non-creatures, but how important is it that you have a 1/2 pinging for 1 every time your opponent does something, as opposed to, something else I could play at 3 that's actually proactive?
No, I agree. I think when I'm looking at these cards, I'm letting the art kind of drive the decision a little bit. And I knew when I put these up, it was worth the discussion. And this is one of the cards that, frankly, the Undying, I'm like, oh my God, I love Undying.
I love Undying too.
I'm going to toss this in
Big
here,
fan.
See what the crowd had to say. But I agree. The fact that it has the opponent making the choice ultimately it's got a weird little hate bear kind of vibe to it.
Yes.
But some of the spells are efficient enough that they're not going to care that they bolt it or they lightning strike it or whatever, right? They're willing to pay that to get past it. So I can see the argument. It's
fair. And I think it really does go to show, like, and I think this is something that will extend out both past you guys and to anybody that's listening to our show, because I would expect that there's some amount of newer to cube curators out there, but I would imagine a lot of people that are listening have got a fair amount of experience. And once you get to that point where you've really worked a lot on the refinement of the cube, cards like this, I don't want to say that if you're looking at this from a commander perspective, you could be a little underwhelmed, but I would consider myself a pretty decent commander deck builder, and I would consider myself at least knowledgeable enough about Magic in general that I can, even when looking at the Doom Cube, and I know I've kind of joked in the past about how it's kind of been a bit of a mishmash of cards, but I still can see a card like that and think, if I've refined my cube, I probably shouldn't be putting in cards like that. Unless Undying is something that I'm particularly interested in, unless Spell Slinging is something that I really, really want to put into my cube from a punishment perspective. But otherwise, especially in red, I just don't see it.
Well, how about this next one? Because I agree with everything you guys said. Like, when I put these on, I knew I was going to get the pushback. I just wanted to evaluate them as individuals. May, would you mind taking on this next card, please? I have a vibe for this one.
Yeah, the next one you picked out was Arabella, the Abandoned Doll. Red and white for a legendary creature artifact toy. 1/3. Whenever she attacks, it deals X damage to each opponent, and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 2 or less. It's a 1/3 attacker. So, I have mixed feelings about it. I don't think that it elicits strong emotions for me in terms of flavor, but in terms of mechanics...
Yeah, so I'm kind of that way. So it's Annabelle is what we're referencing, The Conjuring, right? That's what we're looking at. And I have a Luris package in this cube. And when I looked at this card, I thought it was the aggro push, go low to the ground, that has actually in the past been a detriment to the cube. Again, this cube is very healthy right now. I had to combat aggro a little bit. The first iteration, we've joked about this before, is I built the cube, I sleeved it up, I had everyone come over to play it. I had this whole soundtrack. It was Gwen Stefani was like my leading edge here. I had a great time with it. And then I just watched aggro literally cut people to pieces. And here I am again. About 2 years later, putting aggro right back to where it was. So it's a nice push card. I didn't know what kind of emotions it would elicit in terms of the art mostly, right? I have to be really art curation forward. And it's questionable. I like Annabelle, creeps me out, gives me the vibes, but I wanted to specifically ask May's opinion on this one. I wish Emma was on here too to see what she had to say. But you can see where, like, I want this cube to, I guess, translate this idea of, the multiverse of contributions of women to Magic. I don't know if this card does it.
Yeah, I'm going to put my 2 cents in.
I don't think it does that.
I think
that's my main issue.
Yeah, from a philosophy of your cube, I think this is incredibly off the mark. There's no way on earth I'm putting this in a fem cube. No chance, right?
That's what I was going to ask.
Not only do I think... I just think there's much better choices. Much, much better choices. The card itself, I absolutely love this card. I think it's such an incredible... I always get excited, especially about... I don't know if it's necessarily legendary because I'm thinking about Commander, but I just do love cards like this that just give me great build-around options. And I think this is just such a wonderful build-around card. From the vibe of the cube, absolutely not. Any other home you could find for this card, I couldn't support you more. I'll buy you 10 foil copies.
So, a little bit of a correction here. I do appreciate that you wanted to go for the Annabelle reference, and that's not a reference to The Conjuring. So, what that movie was referencing was an actual doll, like in real life, that was considered to be one of the most haunted objects in the world. And when we take it in the context of it's a reference of a reference of a reference, after a certain amount of times of referring to it, it kind of loses its identity, and that's not really something that elicits much for your environment. And that's all I wanted to add.
Well, the original doll was a Raggedy Ann. from the pairing of Raggedy Ann and Andy, and it was a Raggedy Ann, which was mass produced, by the way. There's so many Raggedy Anns out there, but it's just it's like a Teddy Ruxpin of the time, right? So I can see that too. It's just, yeah, I agree with everybody saying. I just mostly looked at the Mardu push, right? Trying to get the aggro a little bit, kind of push the build around aspect, the Ginny Johnny, which I want to see a little bit more of that idea in the cube.
Well, especially because the cube has generally been about, and the ethos has been, how do you want to support? How do you want to encourage? How do you want to represent, right? And this doesn't really represent anything for my money that really was your initial design philosophy and your ongoing design philosophy for this cube. I feel like it's...
And even mechanically, I don't think it's interesting enough to entice the Johnny Jenny players to get their wheels turning, to make their brain go burr. It's just kind of, yep, I'm now just going to have a bunch of things that have power 2 or less. Unga bunga.
That was the purposes. Yeah, thank you for doing that.
I think in both categories it's an off the mark, but that's okay. That's what these questions.
These cards have not been purchased for the listeners. This is mostly just to get the opinions of.
I will say again, I love the card. I love build aroundy kind of cards, and I think this is a very flavorful.
I considered building her as like a commander.
Commander.
Love her as a card.
Just kidding.
Not sure if this is home.
Let's talk about this next card.
Yeah.
So, Haunted Screen. We have a new artifact, a new mana rock. So this is a 3 colorless mana artifact. You can tap it and add either white or black. You can tap it and pay a life to add green, blue, or red, and then you can pay 7 and put 7 +1/+1 counters on Haunted Screen. It becomes a 0/0 spirit creature in addition to its other types. Activate only once.
This is the ring, and this is what I'm pushing for a little bit here.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was a woman, a female character, which that was, and one of the challenges that I've suffered from this cube, well, I'm okay with the but one of the things that I've suffered from this cube is getting the rocks or the art of the lands and or the mana rocks to be relevant.
Yeah, I can understand as much, again, talking about the philosophy, I can understand the occasional desire out of either necessity or whatever else to include cards that are maybe a little off the mark, if I want to use that term, and that might not be completely accurate, but philosophically to be able to bring cards in that add to the play experience. And I think this is a cool card, right? It's a 3 mana rock that taps for any color. But I think if you wanted that effect, again, there's probably other choices and more powerful and more interesting choices. I think, again, from a flavor perspective, it's fine. But and maybe this is now, as we've continued this discussion through all the cards specifically for this cube, maybe just that this kind of vibe isn't really complementary enough for the philosophy of that cube to really justify putting this in, and there's probably better options out there.
Yeah, I agree.
All right.
I just don't think that it applies here.
That's okay. We're in spooky season, though, and we're kind of wrapping up the Cube Con. Those 3 cubes, the Monopoly, the Fem, and Uberbear's Artifact Cube, will all be featured at CubeCon 2024, so I'm excited about that. And this is really giving me insight as to the additions and subtractions from this list as to what's going to go in those cubes. But I would be amiss not to include a little bit. We are talking a little spooky here, and this episode is going to be a little bit longer, but there's a lot to unpack here in my mind.
There is.
So let's kind of go into what people are here for. When we came to Duskmourn, they're like, why are we not talking about horror cubes? Horror cubes, right? We're literally referencing The Shining. We're referencing Hellraiser. Here we are. Now we're here. All right, everybody. The grand crescendo, sort of. But let's talk about Uberbear's Horror Cube, because everything's got Uberbear, so it's just kind of a branding thing that I do.
And the first one we're going to talk about brings in one of the mechanics that we talked about originally, where we discussed some of the mechanics that are being introduced in this set. So the first one, right, like this one, this is Overlord of the Flood Pits, 3 colorless, 2 blue for an enchantment creature, Avatar Horror. It's a 5/3, so it has impending 4 for 1 colorless and 2 blue. So again, the impending is you cast it, it enters, it has 4 time counters on it for the impending 4, and it isn't a creature until the last is removed, and you actually remove them at the beginning of your end step. Again, it's a 5/3, it's a flyer, and whenever Overlord of the Flood Pits enters or attacks, draw 2 cards, then discard a card. That's a lot of text on a card, but it's a 5-mana creature.
This is the reimagining of the horror cube. So to put it in perspective, I'm trapped in this world of Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley, etc., right? Very gothic horror. And to step outside of that is outside of my comfort zone. But I am seeing like an opportunity here to support more of like the self-mill package, or in this case, it's kind of like a mole drifter that beats you to death. You see where I'm going with this?
I do. And something that we haven't really done throughout the life of our podcast is, we bring up these cards within the context of a cube. Typically, it's either, one of Anthony's cubes or one of May's cubes. So I'll pose this question to you, and maybe this is something that we need to introduce a little bit more, certainly within the show notes, if we don't need to necessarily mention this during every single sort of the speaking segment, if you will. What are you going to replace with this card in that cube?
That's a hard one. Actually, that's to be determined. When I put these on the list, I wanted to kind of get the conversation started and find out where the vibe was from both of you, and then I'll find the cuts. I don't have an answer for that at this moment.
I do. I think it's a strong card, because even just a 5-mana 5/3 for 5 is not bad value. Being able to kind of suspend this card for 3 mana, which again, you still get that, draw 2, discard for only 3 mana, and then you've got this ability that's kind of on the stack, if you will, that's delayed for those 4 turns. I think this is a pretty good effect. And I think it having that evasion means that you should hopefully likely to realize that value, or it's kind of a must answer for your opponent. So I think from a power level perspective, I think it's really on point. I think the art is really cool. It's an okay card. I'm not super excited about it, which I think in the past I might have been, but I think it's probably going to find a home there, and I think Anthony will find a home for this card.
It is just a strong Mole Drifter card.
It is.
And sometimes that's just what you need.
Agreed. And it's interesting that Mole Drifter's kind of fallen out of favor quite a lot, right? So it was a vintage cube staple for years and years and years, right? You've got the ability for a creature to be able to sculpt your hand, really in any situation, is a very, very nice thing to have. And this is a very powerful creature. 5-power creatures with flying are always going to be a huge threat, regardless of the cube, right? Doesn't matter what the power level is. You got a 5-power flyer on the battlefield, you're going to do some damage. And yeah, I think that ability is pretty cool. So I think it'll find a home here. So Anthony, your choice has been generally approved by the council.
Yeah, so I'm kind of leaning into, I know for a fact that in that environment, the horror cube in particular, that control finishers or the idea of like filling your graveyard is lacking outside of self-mill. So this is more of the draw card, looting, if you will, right? And I kind of like it.
More on the hand sculpting side of things.
Yeah, so I'm leaning into that a little bit more.
Strong grease card.
Yeah. So this next card is, I'm just putting in here. People are familiar with it. It's mostly because it's kind of like the idea that I have with the Fem Cube. It's Phantasmal Image. People should be familiar with that card by now. I'm going to skip through it, but it came out with an art that I can now actually put in the horror cube. This art is absolutely just truly disturbing, and that's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
So look at the show notes. I encourage you to go back to that. But this next one that I have is Silent Hall Creeper for 1 colorless and 1 blue. Get an enchantment creature, horror, for a 1/1. Silent Hall Creeper can't be blocked. Whenever Silent Hall Creeper deals combat damage to a player, choose one that hasn't been chosen. The first one is put 2 1/1 counters on Silent Hall Creeper, or draw a card, or Silent Hall Creeper becomes a copy of another target creature you control for a 1/1. I think this card's neat.
Yes.
It's creepy. It's disturbing.
Very, very much like this card. Power level, very cool. Definitely from an abilities perspective, just the fact that it can't be blocked and you can turn it into a 3/3 pretty quickly is not necessarily to be underrated, even in blue, where you're not trying to always be so aggressive, but that I don't think that's to be underestimated. Obviously, draw a card is always nice, but that copy ability is very interesting. This is, again, I think we're going to use this grease term more and more as our cube matures, right? This is a really cool grease card. I think anytime you want to maybe have an ability where you can copy creatures that you have on the battlefield, I think is a very fun and cool effect. So I like it very much.
What do you think, May? Good addition?
Yeah, I do think it's a good addition. I think my major note with it is the fact that I don't think that it's necessarily a grease card because it's not really filling out a space that needed to be filled as much as it's a card that when you're playing, say, control or whatnot, you now have your thing that puts pressure on for a low mana cost. It can replace itself on the first attack, or it can become 3/3 on its first attack, and both of those are increasingly spooky. I think that the modality is really nice. The fact that you can turn it into a copy of something else is just kind of the gravy on top of it.
Yeah, I think maybe the grease thing is because it has, like, draw a card, okay, very generic. The +1/+1 counters could be incredible depending on the cube and what it supports, right? As well as copying another creature. So not necessarily the drawing a card, but I think those two abilities is what kind of gives it maybe a little bit more. And I understand it's not necessarily a grease card, but I think it could be built that way because it's so cheap, because you can copy, because you can put counters on it. And those might be archetypes that are very heavily supported in whatever cube someone out there decides to put it in. So, but yeah, I agree. And I think the power level's super nice.
All right, so let's move on to this next card that Stu and I kind of pre-gamed about. And I gotta give this one to Stu. This card is sick.
All right, so I don't know. It's either, Spider Doll of Nightmares of Death or this card that might be, one of my favorites, or the enchantment that, Aristocrat's Friend. So this one is Into the Pit. This is a enchantment for 2 colorless and a black. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may cast spells from the top of your library by sacrificing a non-land permanent in addition to paying their other costs. I mean, I don't think you need any more introduction to this card other than reading what it does. It's very, very powerful. I think this is going to see play in maybe constructed decks, maybe. Very much so, it's going to see a ton of commander play, and I think from a cube perspective,
this is the Johnny Jenny card that I salivate for.
Yes.
I'm the type of person who sees Experimental Frenzy and, wants to do the thing with it. And this is pretty similar in that regard of, this is telling me a direct way that I'm going to be able to do a thing, and I want to kind of build my way around that.
So in this cube, I have additional 13 black cards. Like, I'm actually secretly Easter egg representing triskaidekaphobia. It's like a theme. And so black is the hardest color to cut. Like, I'm going to struggle to make cut. So this card is going to get in no matter what. Despite what we've talked about before, I'm going to find a home for this card because I do support a very vampire-driven aristocrats type package.
I think that's all you need to say in order to convince anybody that this is a card that's worth putting in your deck, worth drafting. And I think just from a power level perspective, the fact that you've got now that extra ability, look, just even being able to look at the top card of your library anytime is strong enough. But the fact that you can cast spells, there's no restriction on the type of spells that you can cast. But even if it was, you can cast creatures or you can cast whatever, name a popular permanent type, I think that would be pretty strong. But the fact that it's any spell, just by sacrificing a creature, that makes this card so incredibly powerful.
And this is the type of dynamics that I want to introduce this cube, right? Because this cube has, by the nature of Innistrad, become a little formulaic in my mind. Sometimes when we talk about it, I'll tell you that I enjoy the Artifact Cube more than I enjoy Uber's Horror Cube.
Yeah.
For the reasons that sometimes the playlines feel linear. And I think what this set has offered me, it's to break outside that shell.
Yeah. And let's be clear, specifically for this, it's non-land permanent. It's not creature.
Right.
It's non-land permanent. We've kind of talked about this as it's kind of an aristocrats friendly card, which it most definitely is, but it's not, you must sacrifice a creature or you must sacrifice, a specific type. It's any non-land permanent. Could be a token. You can sacrifice it. And you know what would be great? If that token had a skull clamp on it and it was in your artifact cube.
The secret skull clamp episode.
How great would that be?
So I just think that Duskmourn is going to open the cube up a lot more. This set actually is offering me a lot. The next one that we're going to talk about, and this is a little long-winded, but Stu's already smiling again. One more time. Here we go, Stu. Go ahead.
This is, and look, I haven't played Magic in a little while. It's been a busy summer, but I haven't played Commander in a very, very, very long time. And this to me is another one of these very, very Commander powerful, but also just could have outreaches to other formats. So this one is another room. The first half of this is Funeral Room. This is 2 colorless and a black. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. I mean, just the absolute nuts as far as Aristocrats' effects and strategies are concerned. But the right side of this card is Awakening Hall. This is 6 colorless and 2 black. So 8 mana cost, not to be scoffed at. But when you unlock this door, return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield.
Ultimate
that
self-mill
is a
payoff.
It's a fantastic
living death
self-mill
payoff.
effect.
It's amazing. Like I'm so impressed. Like that's something that I wanted to push a little forward here.
You don't even need to build around that too much, right? The Funeral Room effect by itself, that Aristocrats drain and gain, just can't go wrong with that. So having this option, and again, go all the way back to what May mentioned, when you've got these adventure cards where you've got these dual effects from a single card, and I am a huge fan. Anytime you've got choice, anytime you've got multiple effects, I think that really does increase the power level significantly. So something like this, and these are 2 super duper powerful effects, right? The Funeral Room for 3, I think that is very strong, but Awakening Hall for 8 mana, it's 8 mana. It's a lot of mana, and especially in black, that's a very, very, very heavy cost. But the effect that it has is undeniably very, very, very powerful. And I think this is the kind of card that is just super duper fun. I'm going to be looking at ways to make this work when I'm drafting a deck. Can I accelerate my mana a little bit? What color do I need to bring in green? Do I need to go heavy on the artifacts, right? What kind of support do I have to make a card like this work? Can I sacrifice things? Can I mill things? Can I bring lands back? Cards like this are so much fun for me to build around, and I'm always going to be happy to see them.
May, what are your thoughts?
It's expensive.
It's
mana cost wise,
expensive.
it's expensive.
It is.
But I agree with Stu that it does elicit excitement. That it is a card that when you look at either half of it, you think, I'm going to be doing some stupid things with this potentially. And it kind of is the live the dream type card that we've mentioned a couple times, but I think that's okay.
I think it's a dynamic this cube needs. Again, the linear form and function of this cube, I need this cube to be different. I gotta
If you get to 8 mana and have a bunch of things in your graveyard, at that point you've earned it.
Yeah, you deserve to win. GG. Congrats.
So one of the effects or one of the mechanics that I've been, I guess, delirious or not interested in would be delirium. Right? Like, okay. So over time, I've always been nervous about this idea of introducing that mechanic because it's very specific on the requirements of the cube, which is at this time has been humans versus spirits versus werewolves versus zombies.
Yep.
And so it's been, again, very Mary Shelley versus Bram Stoker. Now I'm kind of wanting to do a little bit more here. This is opening up a whole new lane for me. So now Demolisher spawn for 5 colorless and green. I got a 7/7 enchantment creature horror, trample haste. So already does what I needed to do already. Wins. And then as a side note, Delirium. When Demolisher spawn attacks, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, other attacking creatures get +4/+4 until the end of turn.
This is a little on the win more-y kind of side.
I don't think so. I think when Avacyn Restored came out, they gave us Craterhoof Behemoth. That was already there and weird.
They did. But it only has to attack, and that's not a huge problem, right? And +4/+4 is no small thing. I mean, that is a finisher, no doubt. But how many creatures do you really need to have in order to finish a game? 2, 3, 1, whatever.
Trample haste 7/7.
Trample haste 7/7.
That's the one creature that I need.
And maybe I'll specifically say that. I actually think the Delirium side of thing is the more win more side of
gravy.
things. I think if you're attacking with a 7 mana trample haste 7/7, then that's probably the part that's going to win the game. Whereas the Delirium is the more win more side.
I agree 100%. But I agree. Again, Craterhoof didn't make any sense. It was on the Gothic horror place of Innistrad, and then for no reason whatsoever, he had this giant beast that just did this effect too, sort of, kind of, which still sticks in cubes.
My thought about this card is that this is a perfectly playable card that people would be okay drafting. It does the thing that green dumb top-end cards want to do, but it can lead to that occasional moment that people will remember forever. That time that somebody did get Delirium and stick this card, and have something else to attack with to just enough close the game, and it will come up like once, and nobody will forget it. And I think for that reason alone, cards like this should be considered. Because, well, yes, Delirium at its surface level can be just additive distraction. But it can also lead to a lot of really fun blowout moments. So
yes, it's going to win games. Somewhere, somehow, that card is going to win games. Tell us about it. Show us your decks. Deck Boast, UberCube Discord.
All right, so there's more cards that I have on the list, but for the sake of time, I kind of want to transition over to Power.
Listen, it's 2024. Everybody commutes for 2 hours nowadays, okay? So we're giving them something to listen to.
You got something to listen to for the next 2 weeks.
If you're on the train or in your car stuck in traffic, we feel your pain. All right, so now let's get into the vintage cube discussion, right? There's other cards, like Anthony mentioned in the show notes. I'm not convinced. I'm going to put this out there right away. I'm not convinced that this is going to be any kind of shake-up to the vintage environment. But Anthony would like to talk about Veteran Survivor. You want me to take this one? Read this card out, tell you what it does? So, Veteran Survivor, this is a 1 white mana 2/1. It has the keyword survival. At the beginning of your second main phase, if Veteran Survivor is tapped, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. Do like that. Nice ability. How relevant is it? We'll see.
Very.
As long as there are 3 or more cards exiled with Veteran Survivor, it gets +3/+3 and has hexproof.
For 1 mana.
This is
good.
A nice card.
It's good.
It's a nice card. Is it Mother of Runes?
No.
Is it Giver of Runes?
Yeah, it's definitely
Giver. Is it Thraben Inspector?
Yeah. It's pretty good. It's like literally taking on Reanimator just head on.
It's taking on Reanimator.
And Storm.
Does this, right? So I'm asking this question, and this is not a leading question because I do have an opinion. Do you think that ability, as good as it is against those, do you think this relegates a card like this? If you're building your mono white aggro deck in a vintage cube, do you think that ability and the fact that it doesn't have something as incredibly relevant early on like Mom does or like Thraben Inspector to draw you a card, do you think that ability relegates it to a sideboard card predominantly?
Yes, it's tech for a sideboard.
I don't think it.
I do.
I actually think that is strong enough when it's hitting for 2, and the fact that cards end up in the graveyard as frequently as they do, I actually think this is mainboardable. I'm going to put that out there. I think this is mainboardable.
That was a trap. I agree. You told me you didn't like this card.
But I think that this isn't really a tech card against those. I think that this is just an aggro card.
I agree 100%. This isn't shaking things up. It's another 1-drop with the ability to be aggressive at face value, with the possibility to be absolutely out of control. A 5/4 hexproof is just bonkers good, right? For only 1 mana. The fact that you don't have to do anything for that second ability to trigger. All it's doing is if it's tapped. You are expecting with white to be attacking every turn, and you are certainly expecting to be attacking with a 2-power creature. I don't really care in any color what my opponent is blocking with at that stage of the game in turn 2, turn 3, maybe even turn 4, unless they've really accelerated quickly. But I still think that this is powerful enough, and I think that effect is potentially enough for me to mainboard. Because I'm never mad about getting 1-drops that hit reasonably well. 2 power is very strong, and I think the ability is relevant enough. And I think I don't even think you're giving this enough credit as far as the Reanimator, because I think there's more strategies. It's an easy kind of like thing to first look at, right? Oh, exiling from the graveyard, surely that's good against Reanimator. Yes, it is, but there's so many other strategies that I think, and not even just other strategies, but just incidental effects that I think that'll be strong against.
Crucible,
lands matters,
yeah.
Exactly. I think there's a lot of effects where that ability is going to just have an incidental or positive effect. I think it's pretty good.
No, that wasn't really hard to sell. All right, let's move over to the next card that I have on this list. And it's going to be the Overlord of the Boiler Bilges. For 4 colorless and red, you get a 5/5. Enchantment creature, Avatar Horror. Impending 4 for 2 colorless and red, alternate casting cost. Whenever Overlord of the Boiler Bilges enters or attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target. Stu and I are pre-gaming a little bit about this one. I think this has an opportunity to strike for 4, and then later come down to be like an Inferno Titan type of S card. Do you disagree with that statement?
I do, because I think if I want to do 4 damage, I will Flame Slash, or like I don't really know if
that's creatures exclusively though. This is Two-Face.
It is, but I kind of feel that I'm less worried about going face. I think 4 mana for 4 damage is okay. You are getting a creature, but you're waiting a long time. Boros has just become absolutely bonkers in Vintage Cube over the last few months, year or so. In the Vintage Cube, I'm not convinced that this card is remotely good enough at either the 4 or 5 mana slot or 4 or 6 mana slot to warrant an inclusion over what exists currently.
I agree. There's just too much competition, and it's way too expensive for the context of Vintage for it to really make waves. If I see this as, sure, it's another card that I could cheat into play, sure, it's modal, but there's a cost to that modality of it's not relevant to at least turn 4, and that is a big ask.
It's a long time. And Anthony, actually, while we were pre-gaming, his replacement, if you will, the card that he talked about was Inferno Titan, right?
Or no, Thundermaw Hellkite.
So, that was the comparison, right? So it comes in. And the card that you were going to replace is Thundermaw Hellkite. I actually don't think Thundermaw Hellkite is playable anymore. And Inferno Titan really hasn't been playable for some time because it's just too slow. And I really do think this is just too slow.
I disagree.
It's way too slow. Because once you get up to a certain mana value for Vintage, you're looking at how am I cheating this into play rather than... So hypothetically, let's say you made this Sneak and Show deck. Why would I want to choose this in addition to whatever other Sneak and Show cards, the usual attendees for that deck, right? Why does this deserve a spot alongside those?
Convince me, Anthony.
I don't think I can. I think I actually concede here a little bit. It's been weird. I'm looking at it. I want to get some new tech in here is ultimately what it comes down to. But this next one, Stu and I pre-gamed a little bit.
This one is fun. Yep. So this is another enchantment room. Walk-in closet, 2 colorless and a green. You may play lands from your graveyard. So nice Crucible effect. And then we have, the right side is Forgotten Cellar, 3 colorless and 2 green. When you unlock this door, you may cast spells from your graveyard this turn. And if a card would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, this turn, exile it instead. So basically it's Yawgmoth's Will for 5 mana.
It's pretty good. It's spicy.
That's a good card.
Yeah. It's a good card.
Yeah, this is one I'm going to pick up because I think this actually helps out the Lands Matters and Storms packages.
So
it's not
Second Crucible World. It's just
tech.
Face value of, we now have 2 of them so we can do strip mining garbage. And on the other half of pay 5 mana, gets to cast whatever from your graveyard. And if you're at that stage of you're able to cast this and the things at your graveyard, the game's probably over.
Yeah, I'm really not convinced about the Forgotten Cellar side. I think 5 mana is a lot of mana to spend.
It's a lot.
On an effect that you only get until end of turn. I think you really need to have a lot of mana to benefit from that, unless you have some number of very low cost spells in your graveyard that you want to cast. And that's not outside the realm of possibility either, right?
LED?
Absolutely. Yeah. Sure, but you're not putting LED traditionally in a green deck. You're putting it in a blue-red deck.
Metamorphose?
Maybe you're putting black.
Why are you not? So I think green does bridge a little bit here.
Not really. Not in a Storm deck.
Okay.
No, I think Storm that the second half has potential to come up, but I think that the game's just going to be over by the time that that's going to come up. I think that it is much more powerful by the fact that, hey, this is a second Crucible of Worlds with upside.
Yes.
It's a little better than Ramanap, too. Mildly better than Ramanap.
Yeah, I mean, it's better than Ramanap purely by virtue of the fact that it's an enchantment, which is harder to remove than a creature.
I agree with that. All right, so I hope that this has been enlightening in some form. Again, we really wanted to focus on the 3 cubes that are going to be featured at CubeCon 2024, which is the Fem Cube, the Monopoly, and Uber's Artifact Cube. But
let's leave our listeners with a thought, right? So this is something we'd love to get your feedback on. Again, Anthony and I were talking about this as he comes over and hangs out at my house for a little while before we start recording. So, mate, we were talking about this new cycle of lands that has been included in Duskmourn. I'm not sure what the name is.
Triskaidekaphobia lands is what we're calling them.
Triskaidekaphobia lands. So this is a full 10-land cycle of lands that have the following ability. They enter the battlefield tapped unless a player, not an opponent, a player has 13 or less life. They tap for one of 2 colors, right? Blue, white, black, blue, etc., etc. They're not fetchable. We'd like to know from our listeners, how playable do you think these lands are in your cube?
They're common. Right?
I think they're reminiscent of the fast and slow lands is what I'm looking at here. Like,
okay.
That was kind of what Stu and I were pregame beforehand. Was like
Anthony's rating them a little higher than I am. I'm kind of putting them above Guildgate, certainly because there is a condition upon which they can enter untapped. I don't really think I'm putting them much higher than that. But the fact that they do check both players' life is not insignificant. I think they're just about okay. And I think that's where I stand on them. Mate, tell us, do you think they're going to find a place in your cube? What's your overall opinion of them?
In my cubes, no. But I do think that this is an important distinction. As a cycle, of a cycle of common lands, mind you, that can come in untapped, I think that they do have potential to be really good. So, any of the black combination lands are going to be innately stronger than any of the rest of them. So let's say you have a Selesnya one and you have a Rakdos one. The Rakdos one is just going to be so much higher up in terms of potential payoff compared to the Selesnya one. It's not even funny.
Would you argue the same, maybe, let's say for the Boros one, right? Boros is typically a pretty aggressive color pairing. Would you argue that maybe, so it's Razor Trap Gorge is the Rakdos card, and Raucous Carnival, which is the Boros one. So would you maybe agree with the fact that those are maybe a little more valuable because they are in those aggressive, drainy, more likely to see a player lose life colors, and maybe the blue-white as an example, the control-y side of things, where life is less likely to be swingy early on, that maybe they're a little less valuable?
Yes. So I think the main thing to keep in mind is that in common, specifically pauper, peasant, whatever, getting lands that have the potential to untap based off of either player being low enough is important enough as an aspect for aggro decks, because when you look at multicolored decks in peasant, pauper, whatever, we have a hard time justifying going into other colors at the moment, because if you get up to 3 colors, whatnot, then you're going to have to sacrifice a lot of that speed for potentially tap lands, because you're very, very restricted on the type of lands that you have. But these open up the potential for aggro to keep up with a lot of those type of mid-rangey, multicolored decks that are able to just tutor any land that they need, because we've had so many of the dual-type lands that come in tapped for common that it has kind of been the dichotomy between here's our aggressive mono, maybe 2-color decks, and then here's our mid-rangey to control-y 3 to 4 color decks, right? Who are able to just tutor and cycle out to grab whatever they need, and they will always have the colors versus you're kind of more color restricted, and this is a way that those aggressive decks can get back in.
I like that. That's a great explanation. And I don't disagree. I think at that common/uncommon restricted cube, I think there's maybe a home for them, but we'll see.
All right. Yeah. Well, I hope this has been fun. I hope this has been
we don't do necessarily like set reviews, but I think we've gone through a lot of the cards in this set as well as the mechanics. So hopefully this is somewhat insightful. And, if you're out there and you're looking for some of these cards, first of all, flavor off the charts.
Oh, 100%.
Some very interesting new mechanics. I think this has got the potential to be both a complementary set and a shake-up set for a lot of cubes out there. And Anthony, obviously, I get to play with your cubes the most, and I'm excited to see what kind of impact these cards have on your cubes.
Hell yeah. Put skull clamp in every cube, according to Stu.
That's
all right. Let's go to socials.
All right. Let's first of all, without further ado, could not go a second further without giving a huge thanks to all of our patrons, including our latest Chris Fitzgerald, thank you so much, as well as Timber Dragon, Brian Christensen, Keaton Schultz, Lord Justice, Chris Singer, Nick LaPointe, Preston, and Sam McKenna. A huge thank you to all of you guys. You're just keeping the lights on. And if there was no lights on, we wouldn't be able to see the cards that we're talking about,
I don't think we can anyways.
If you want to get in on the discussion, you can always check out the MTGFB, which stands for Facebook, for the Zoomers out there, drafting page at facebook.com/groups/MTGCube, where our resident host, Mr. Anthony Adams, is a moderator over there. And you know what that means?
Ban hammer.
Ban hammer. If you do enjoy this episode or any of our other episodes, we would really appreciate, give us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Really goes a long way to getting us out there to the greater community. And you can also support us by using our ultrasleeves.com/UberCube affiliate link for 5% off purchase, or our inkgaming.com/UberCube affiliate link. Go check them out. Dice bags, mouse pads, custom products, and large volume products available for your cube or any other Magic the Gathering experience. Reach out to us at Twitter. We are at UberCubeMTGPod. You can also email us via UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com if you've got a longer question or comment about your cube, Anthony's cubes, your own cube, someone else's cube. You can reach us at email, ubercubemtgpodcast@gmail.com if you've got a question about the podcast or an episode. And, as always, the UberCube Discord. Come check out, in particular, the Deckbows channel. What we've been seeing in there recently, I've been seeing some spice in that Deckbows channel. Yeah. All the spice. And again, www.patreon.com/UberCube. Come check us out. If you want to help us keep the lights on, really helps us out.
And other than that, we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is Happy Horse!